The Dallas Cowboys are expected to interview Robert Saleh for their head coach opening. Do we think he'll actually get it? We'll break it down on this episode of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. Welcome back. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Leonard McCool. You can follow him on Twitter at McCoolBCB. Leonard, we haven't talked in like a day, and it seems like there's been absolutely no Cowboy news, but yet a bunch of Cowboy news. I want to start with this kind of nugget from Jane Slater, who said that Jerry Jones has been doing a lot of the calling and kind of doing some of the whispers solo by himself when it comes to the head coaching job or the head coaching gig. First of all, do you buy that? And what do we think about it?
I don't know if I buy it. I don't know. Like, I kind of feel like maybe that's also something that Jerry is saying. Like, hey, did you hear that Jerry Jones is the only person making calls to these? You know, it's like, I don't know. It could be true. It could be that Jerry, is like, don't worry, guys. I'll make some phone calls, but I have to imagine that there are, look, as somebody who works in a major corporation, there's always somebody else who's trying to cover their butts, like while the boss is doing what he wants to do. Right. So I wonder if there aren't, and that's kind of how a lot of these initial parts of negotiations go too. It's like back channel stuff. It's like, like the assistant to the GM calling an agent and being like, hey, so what's the general consensus, the feel of this player and that. So I certainly think that there are folks inside the building that are trying to project that Jerry is taking this by the helm and he's leading the charge, or however that's trying to be projected. I don't know. I think that there's probably more than just Jerry, making calls, finding things out, gathering information about these coaches. This is too important a job for someone who needed to ask Mike McCarthy how practice went on Friday before the last game of the season. So,
yeah, my guess is that Jerry's just putting out feelers to certain people, but not actually running these interviews by themselves. Now, we did finally get some news about some stuff. According to Tom Pelissero of NFL Network, the Cowboys are expected to interview Robert Saleh, the former defensive coordinator of the 49ers, the former head coach of the New York Jets. First of all, does it make sense to interview Saleh?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it makes sense. It makes sense on a lot of levels to interview Saleh. I think, the cynical aspect of this, of course, is everyone's going to bring up is that there's the Rooney Rule that has to be kind of worked around. And I hate that.
I hope that's not the case. But given the Cowboys' track record with some of this stuff, they interviewed one minority candidate the last time around, and that was Marvin Lewis.
And let's be fair, given the NFL's track record here, it's not a great track record league-wide. But yeah, I do think that is probably part of this. But I'm hoping that it's not all of it, because we did hear, I think Mike Fisher and a couple of different people had mentioned Robert Saleh as a guy that the Cowboys had interest in interviewing, over a month ago, as just a candidate to watch. I think one of the things that you and I discussed before the show that we find potentially interesting about this is, not only just like Robert Saleh as a potential head coach candidate, but maybe you get Saleh in here to kind of feel out, hey, if it doesn't work out as the head coach, would you be interested in coming in as a defensive coordinator if we were to hire an offensive coach of some sort? So I do think that's the other element of that makes this interesting, because I do think if we're making a list, and in the next segment, I'm sure we are, we're going to talk about DC candidates, and I think there's a ton of really good ones out there. But I think for me, Robert Saleh is probably near the top of that list simply because of his experience and how lately he's been very good.
It's pretty clear the Cowboys just want to interview anybody that's worked with Aaron Rodgers before to see, like, hey, how do you manage just terrible? Yeah. No, I also think there is part of this where teams probably want to know, like, hey, we know the Jets are a disaster in so many different ways. Let's bring him in for an interview just to kind of see what happened. And
Yeah.
maybe he's a better coach than that situation has allowed him to be. We've seen plenty of players over the years leave the Jets and have really good careers. I wouldn't be surprised if it was the same thing for the coach.
Did too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing too is that it's not even just that a situation where this was a bad situation. Like this was a specifically bad situation where a player was given free reign over the team essentially by the ownership. So yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of these situations where you can kind of talk yourself into, well, this coach kind of got fired under shifting sands of the ownership or the changes in the franchise. This is specifically a situation where I think Saleh kind of totally got screwed by ownership because they wanted to get Aaron Rodgers and they were basically willing to do whatever Aaron wanted, good or bad, to the franchise. And Saleh was just kind of the first head on the chopping board there.
No, just a couple of other just random thoughts about this is one of the things that I said, I think the last couple of days is I want this to be a comprehensive search for the Cowboys, like interview lots of different, candidates, coordinators, former head coaches from both sides of the ball. Bringing in Robert Saleh at least checks that box. One of the things I would like to know, and if I was interviewing, I would like to ask him about his defense because I thought his defenses just have gotten worse and worse and worse over time with the Jets. And they've had talent. They've had an all-pro corner in Sauce Gardner, a Pro Bowl caliber defensive tackle, Quinn Williams. It seems like the NFL maybe figured out that style of defense a little bit more. They don't blitz a lot. So I do have some questions like, does that style of defense work against today's NFL offenses?
And I think that's a fair question. I certainly think that it wasn't ready to handle the scrutiny of, whatever reverse supportive football is or complementary football is, because that's ultimately what they were getting, from the Jets offense at different points, which I think, put the Jets defense into pretty terrible situations pretty consistently. But having said all of that, that still doesn't quite excuse the fact that, Saleh is a defensive, head coach that was brought in to build a good defense. They had all the pieces they needed. It certainly wasn't a talent issue.
No.
So I do think that there are some questions there. Sometimes situations just don't work out. Sometimes it's like you get the talent you need, and just a key player gets hurt. It would be good to hear from Saleh himself what he thinks went wrong, and where he thinks he can kind of turn a wrench to fix it in the next time he gets an opportunity.
And the other thing that we at least need to mention is that the Cowboys are fascinated with coaches that have former head coaching experience. It's why they went out and hired Mike McCarthy. It's why Jerry Jones wanted to see Jason Garrett be the head coach or the interim coach for half a year before they made him the head coach. So I do think there's part of that in there as well. I'm curious to see when this interview happens, if we get anything from it, but it does seem like right now, Robert Saleh is on a very small list of candidates that the Dallas Cowboys are considering. Leonard, let's talk about defensive coordinator options, because I think most people believe the Cowboys are going to hire an offensive-minded head coach. Who could they pair him with moving forward? We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That is $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps getting better every single week. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings. Whether you're betting on your favorite team or just looking to add some more excitement and drama to the playoffs, FanDuel has got you covered. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $300 in bonus bets. That is FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We are answering your Twitter questions, and this next one is really good. We've got several people that want to know who are some potential defensive coordinator candidates. Question comes from Joshua that the Cowboys could pair with a young offensive-minded coach.
Yeah, and I think you've gathered a list of guys that we're going to go over, but I think the overall note I want to bring up here is that it's a good list. It's the list of potential guys that you could hire for defensive coordinator is long, certainly longer than there are available spots. Yeah. So the opportunity to get a solid defensive coordinator is strong, I think, no matter what the scenario is. So that's good news for the Cowboys here.
And it's really important you get it right. We saw in the first year of Mike McCarthy, he went with Mike Nolan, clearly didn't work. Now, I think in maybe some different situations and scenarios, that COVID year messed a lot of things up. Maybe that could have worked, but they hired Dan Quinn in 2021 and their defense was outstanding the next 3 years. So finding the right DC really matters. Let's go through this list. We don't have to spend a ton of time on each name, but the most obvious one is just Mike Zimmer. We got a report yesterday from Tom Pelissero that he's open to all options this offseason, which to me is like, pay me enough money and I'll come back and coach.
Yeah, and it does. I mean, I wasn't sure if, like, for some reason that there would be some sort of specific tie between Zim and McCarthy. I didn't think so. I thought that more Zim's ties are more to the Cowboys specifically.
They just coached against each other in the NFC North.
Yeah. So I'm glad to see that he's kind of open to all options, and if the Cowboys wanted to bring him back, maybe with a different head coach, that potentially could be an option. I love having that in my back pocket for sure.
If you want another coordinator that's just going to blitz the crap out of you, Wink Martindale was awesome for Michigan this year. It seems like he wants back in the NFL. Wink Martindale is an option, especially if you want an older defensive mind to pair with a young head coach.
Yeah, Wink's a guy that doesn't necessarily have a ton of the head coaching experience, like at least the kind of we're looking at. But yeah, a ton of experience in the NFL, a ton of experience just in general. Very similar kind of scheme to Zim. I think it would probably be a pretty straightforward transition, at least in mentality. But yeah, I think another guy that an aggressive attacking defensive coordinator that will get after the quarterback.
Yeah, Robert Saleh is obviously a name that we just mentioned. We don't need to go in further there. Lou Anarumo from the Bengals. He was let go this year. His defenses have historically played really, really well. Just didn't have a ton of talent. It was clear it wasn't working with the Bengals.
Yeah, I mean, again, the issue with playing with the Bengals is that you're not going to get a ton of resources, right, from ownership. And the fact is that if you perform well with the resources you have and then you lose some more, it's not coming back. So it's going to look bad. And there's definitely a chance that, that you're going to have very big fluctuations. The fact that he was able to get what he did with basically one defensive lineman that was, the entire NFL sack leader, and then, some other scrubs at different points because of injuries or whatever, was impressive, but obviously not good enough to keep his job. This is a guy who was a head coach, name that was being floated around for years. So the fact that he's being just floated as a defensive coordinator, I think is something that all teams should kick the tires on and find out, hey, did Lou kind of really lose it? Or is this a situation where he just needs a change of scenery and this is still a very strong defensive mind?
One of the things I'll say about him, like his coverages are really good. He just doesn't really blitz ever. So if you're looking for an aggressive attacking style of defense, that's not Lou's style, but that doesn't mean it hasn't been successful in the past. So keep that in mind. Yep. Another defensive coordinator that doesn't blitz ever is Brandon Staley, who was the head coach of the Los Angeles Chargers. He coached Kellen Moore actually worked under him in 2023. This seems like a very realistic possibility if Kellen Moore is the head coach.
Yeah, Staley is a name that Cowboys fans should probably get ready to know if they don't know already. Just because I do think look, if Kellen Moore is the actual leader of the most likelihood of the clubhouse, I think Brandon Staley is by far the most likely defensive coordinator that he would choose. So it is good for the Cowboys to kind of fans to kind of get, introduced to him if they aren't already. He's an interesting, name. He's obviously, the way we all know him is because he burst onto the scene as the defensive coordinator of the Rams. With Sean McVay, led them to what was, I'm pretty sure at the time when he was there, the number one defense in the NFL, and by quite a large margin. They were really, really, really good. And then obviously he gets the job at the Chargers, and he never really is able to kind of reproduce that sort of talent or that sort of situation with the Chargers. They just never really kind of got, the defense that they were looking for. They were always extremely poor against the run. I mean, frankly, all you have to do is go back to the Cowboys game against the Chargers. I think it was week 2 or 3 of 2021 or 2, right? Where the Cowboys were just they weren't able to throw the ball, but they were able to run the ball all over the Chargers to that for that victory. And I think that's going to be the situation. Like, this is a guy who is is going to be a shell coverage guy. He was big on kind of bringing in the rotational post snap safety, rocket and roll in your safeties. He was big on that, like giving different pre snap looks to than post snap looks. He's a younger coach. He's definitely one of those guys that's going to have an influx of new ideas there. And I think his style of defense is the kind of style that is still kind of very prevalent in different teams. Like you're seeing the Eagles and all kind of come from that same tree, right? So I do think there is some questions whether he can continue to produce that kind of defense. Obviously he didn't do it very well in the Chargers, but I think he is certainly a name that's intriguing just because of his approach. And because I think the last time he was a defensive coordinator, last time he was solely a defensive coordinator, he did a really good job. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out.
His last game with the Chargers, I believe they gave up 70 points. I'm not joking. 70 points to Aiden O'Connell and Zamir White. Not great. Here's another thing that I have a little bit of an issue with is that I wonder, again, let's say Kellen Moore's the head coach. I wonder if Kellen Moore and Brandon Staley's personalities are a little too similar to one another. Because I think like Dan Quinn and Mike McCarthy had a good blend of personalities, right? Having two kind of quieter coach, head coach and defensive coordinator. I don't know how well that would.
That's interesting. It's an interesting thought. Maybe what you need to do is pair them with a crazy, wild-eyed special teams coach. Yeah.
Well, maybe, but I think like in a vacuum, I think like Kellen Moore and Mike Zimmer would work, or Kellen Moore and Wink Martindale. Brandon Staley and Kellen Moore makes me feel not great. But let's get to some other names. Dennis Allen, who was the head coach of the Saints and the Raiders a long time ago. He's been somebody, man, when he can just focus on defense, he's awesome. But as a head coach, not so much.
I think you nailed it right there, right? I'm super interested in him as a defensive coordinator, super not interested in him as a head coach. No. Like he's proven that he doesn't have the temperament, the mentality, I would say the organizational skills to kind of be a head coach. But as a defensive coordinator, like he has been a thorn in the side of offenses like for years. And frankly, sneakily, the Saints have been one of the most pain in the butt defenses to face these last years. I mean, they plan really well for what your offense does. They haven't always had all the horses to be good. They haven't always had all the talent to be good because of their cap situation, their aging situation. Like they've had good players that they've relied on that, always seem to get hurt or are older. So it's been kind of inconsistent, but on a schematic level, like I think that, Dennis Allen has been one of the best at really challenging offenses to play, almost kind of Belichickian, right? Where it's like he makes defenses, he makes your offense play a little bit left-handed, where you're not quite doing what you want to do on offense, and he's going to make you beat them that way. So I'm interested in Dennis Allen if he wants to be a defensive coordinator, but only as a defensive coordinator.
All right, let's go to some old friend alert. What about Matt Eberflus, who was the Bears head coach? He was the Dallas Cowboys defensive coordinator. I think he played. I think he was the coach when Kellen Moore was playing for this team. I'm pretty sure back in 2015. Eberflus, I think, is a really good defensive-minded coach. That's one that I like quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think Eberflus, and Saleh and I'm trying to think of, Gus Bradley probably.
That's the last name on my list, Gus Bradley. You
Yeah.
throw him in there as well.
Those are all very similar kind of mindset coaches. They're coverage coaches, right? They're going to attack you with 4-down run pass rushers, right? And then drop guys behind it. They're not like huge blitz guys necessarily. So I think it's really about kind of sorting that out. I mean, Eberflus is a cover 3, cover 1 guy from way back, right? I mean, he goes back to the Rod Marinelli type of kind of tree of defense in some ways, and I think on a X's and O's wise, I have no problem with it. I think he's shown that he can be adaptive, and he's formed his scheme to a couple different spots at this point since being with the Cowboys. I think that the question will become: is there a bridge burn situation? I know his wife was quite vocal about the Cowboys ownership and front office when they were leaving. So I don't know if there was behind the scenes drama there as well. But yeah, he's a name that's certainly worth on an X's and O's level considering.
Money can fix a lot. Don't worry.
Money fixes a lot, buddy.
I just a couple more. You mentioned Gus Bradley. He got fired from the Colts. That's one that I'm probably good on. I think his defense is
Thank you.
Patrick Graham, who has been the defensive coordinator with the Raiders and with the Giants, is actually somebody that I like quite a bit. He has not had a lot of talent to work with over the last couple of years. Somebody that I would want to at least bring in for an interview. And then maybe the name that gets me the most excited is Jim Leonard, who is the passing game coordinator on defense for the Broncos. He was with, was it Wisconsin?
Wisconsin.
He was with Wisconsin for a long time. Everybody that talks about Jim Leonard tells us how smart he is and how he's going to be a great head coach. He's another one that I would love to see the Cowboys interview.
I don't know what happened with Jim Leonard. I mean, I'll just say this. 3 or 4 years ago, Jim Leonard was the name that nobody could stop talking about as a defensive coordinator candidate, a head coach candidate in the NFL. I think he may have played the situation poorly on a career level, I think is what happened, is because I think right around the time that he was starting to become just super hot as the defensive mind to have, I think Wisconsin's fortunes turned a little bit. And so because of the results on the field with Wisconsin, not defensively, just as a team, right? His name kind of cooled a little bit. But I'm sorry, you mentioned it to me earlier. Where is he currently coaching?
He's the Broncos passing game coordinator. I don't know if you looked at it this year. Denver's defense was pretty good this season.
Yeah, and again, like I as far as an X's and O's mind, like he's a guy that I've been interested in for a long, long time. And I think most people that follow football have been interested in as a defensive coordinator for a long, long time. So the fact that he could come back up as an opportunity, I'm not exactly sure why he wasn't given an opportunity before then, because I agree. I do think he's a guy that has proven at a very high level that he can be an extremely good defensive coach. I mean, think about all the great defensive players that have come out of Wisconsin while he was the coach there. It's not like Wisconsin is a big time program, but it's not Michigan, it's not Ohio State. And he's producing players that are, quality of that same ilk. So and on top of that, producing some very good defenses as well. I'm interested hardcore in Jim Leonard if he is a candidate for a defense coordinator with one of these head coaches.
All right, Leonard, hindsight is 2020, but let's talk about whether the Cowboys should have kept Dan Quinn last offseason. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. Growing your small business in 2025 comes down to how well that you can hire. And let's face it, better hires start with smarter insights. That's where LinkedIn comes in. With the strongest hiring data available, LinkedIn helps you identify the right candidates, giving you the confidence to make the best decisions for your business. I've used LinkedIn Jobs in the past, and I can tell you it's an absolute game changer when it comes to hiring the right fit. Small businesses are wearing so many hats, so every hire is crucial. LinkedIn gets that. That's why they connect you with the best candidates using data that you're not going to be able to find anywhere else. From unique skills and interests to connections that you share, LinkedIn helps you find the right person for the job. In fact, 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn has helped them find high quality candidates. Hire smarter this year and find your next great hire on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That is linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, check out the new Locked On NFL show. 2 shows every single day. One in the morning with Tyler Rowland, one in the afternoon with Tony Wiggins. Available wherever you get your podcasts. All right, last question here from Jess. Should the Cowboys have kept Dan Quinn last offseason and let Mike McCarthy go? You look at the success that Washington has had already. They went 12-5 in the regular season. They are in the divisional round in year 1 under Dan Quinn. Did Dallas mess up here?
I think I think we need to parse, Washington's success with, what part of Washington's success is Dan Quinn central? I think that Dan Quinn is a fantastic coach. I mean, I'm a big fan. I like what he's done up in Washington. There's, as far as leadership and all that, I don't know that it was only, having Jaden Daniels hit the way that he hit had a lot to do with the success that the Commanders are facing right now. And it's not like the Quinn defense has been lights out in Washington, know? So I think that the situation at the end of the 2023 season for the Cowboys was complicated, and I think they knew going into this season that it was going to be a kind of a rebuilding year. So I kind of think that if you had fired Quinn, fired McCarthy, hired Quinn as the head coach, you're probably still seeing a pretty serious step back from this team from where you saw them in 2023. And I don't know that you're getting any closer to fixing what ails you on defense, because that's the other thing I think that we are kind of wiping away from our history, which we shouldn't, is that if we want to talk about the biggest culprit for what happened on that field in Arlington against the 7th seed in the playoff game, I mean, Dan Quinn's got to be near the top of that list.
Yes.
It was a complete defensive collapse, even more than an offensive collapse, which caused what happened.
There's been a couple people this week that have been like, I'm even more convinced now that Dan Quinn was already looking ahead to his coaching job after going into the playoffs, because he had a bunch of interviews going into that week. I don't necessarily believe that, but it was bad, and I agree with you. Like, the defense was horrific in that game.
And again, it's not like he's gone over to that situation and made the defense. Washington already had a lot of really talented defenders on the team. He certainly brought some more. He brought over Dorrance Armstrong, who's had a great year for them. But it's not like they didn't have several first-round picks in the middle of that defense already. That frankly has kind of supplemented some of the problems that the Dan Quinn defense has had in the past, right? Which is why the Cowboys defense was left in the state that it was, right? Where underdeveloped the defensive tackle.
There is part of it's like, Bobby Wagner, I think, was a second team All-Pro player this year. And I mean, we know that Bobby Wagner wanted to come play for the Cowboys and play for Dan Quinn, but Dallas always said they didn't have the money for it. You do wonder, if Dan Quinn would have gotten his way a little bit more, maybe the defense would have been better in Dallas.
Maybe. But I also wonder, is that the thing that makes you regret? The thing the reason this conversation is coming up is because Dan Quinn is led his team to the divisional round of the playoffs. Right?
Yes, of course.
So I guess the question is, how much of that do you attribute specifically to Dan Quinn and what he provided versus just a stable situation, a general stable situation in Washington, and them getting the number 1 offensive player that came out in the draft last year, and that all working. So I think that Dan Quinn probably would have had a different results, maybe better than Mike McCarthy. But I also think that we would be sitting here probably in a very similar situation, except with a coach that we aren't really necessarily ready to fire and start over with. I would take, if ultimately at the end of the day we're going to start over with this 2025 season, I'll take that outcome with Mike McCarthy last year than potentially perpetuating the same kind of stale situation just with Quinn as the head coach and it maybe not getting any better.
I honestly, I don't know how to feel. And again, I wish I had a really cool answer that everybody would brag about, but I don't. Like, Dan Quinn is quote unquote a culture builder, but that really, to me, that just means you're winning right now, because we saw that the culture in Atlanta got really bad when they started to lose. And I think they're having this magical season and it's awesome to watch, right? Like they're winning all of these close games. But if they flip that, like we know it happens in the NFL, and you don't win all these coin flip games and you're 6-11 next year, I don't know what the culture is going to be like in Washington. Now, the advantage that Dan Quinn's going to have compared to some of these other coaches is that he's got a quarterback on a rookie contract and over $100 million in cap space to spend next year. So they're going to be able to load up with talent. But he wouldn't have been able to do that in Dallas. He would have had an old roster, or not an old roster, an expensive roster where he was going to be limited on the guys that he could bring in and sign. I think it's working out really well in Washington. I don't necessarily think it would have worked out in Dallas.
Yeah, I mean, they won 6 coin flips out of 6 opportunities at certain points this year. If they had lost half of them, if they had gone 50-50 like they probably should have, we're probably not having this conversation.
No, they end up being a 9-8 team that misses the postseason.
Yeah, so I think that there is some circumstance that they've been lucky that Dan Quinn's done a good job as a head coach. I'm certainly not to try to take anything away from him on that. Absolutely not. But I don't know that Dan Quinn fixes the Cowboys situation. And I think that I don't know that Dan Quinn was the answer to breaking through a ceiling when Dan Quinn was part of the reason that ceiling existed in the first place, to be honest.
I think he's the right coach for Washington. I don't know if he would have been the right coach for Dallas. I honestly don't know. Maybe the longer this goes on in Washington, if he can build them into a sustained winner, maybe that's when we'll look back and say, yeah, Dallas made a mistake not holding on to him. I just don't know that we can say definitively that it was a mistake right now. All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen of the day. Go check out the channel on YouTube. We are free and available on all platforms. Follow Landon on Twitter at McCoolBCB. I'm at Marcus_Mosier, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.